Acrylic metal paints. Some are good, most are trash, and if you're anything like me, you have way too many of them. But what if I told you that you might only actually need one? Philip here from Manning the Fort, and today I'm going to be taking on a Necron Royal Warden with a lot of different types of metallic surfaces using only one metal paint. Now, I can't take credit for coming up with this idea. Like many of the best ideas I've come across in my year and a half of taking my painting more seriously, this one comes from Marco Frazzoni, but I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different perspective on it than he tends to in his videos. Here, I have my Necron Royal Warden. I've primed him with a glossy black, in this case Molotov One for All. Now I'm spraying him from above with the star of the show, Vallejo metal colored duraluminum. When painting metallics, especially something completely metallic that you want to have good shine, you help yourself out a lot by starting from a glossy primer. Acrylic metallics are all pretty translucent to varying degrees, so some of that shine from the primer will come through and help you out in the end. While I'm airbrushing this, you could do it by hand, though Vallejo metal color paints tend to be quite runny and it's pretty easy for brush marks to show through. If you have a metal you prefer, that's fine, but for my money, it's duraluminum all the way. When airbrushed on, this stuff is about as good as it gets without resorting to alcohol-based paints. Before I get too far into turning this Royal Warden into something other than a silver blob, I wanted to point out that he's actually the second model from the first issue of Imperium Magazine. I've subscribed to Imperium, so I'm going to be getting a lot of Necrons and Space Marines over the course of the next, I don't know, year and a half or so. And I want to do a little bit of a paint-along. So if you've got any particular schemes or techniques you want to see tried with either faction, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Back to our undead space robot buddy. If we look at the official paint job, he's done up as Zarakan Dynasty. That means a coppery, almost bronze-tinted body with some gold accents and the underlying skeletal parts staying silver, and topping that off with that classic green Necron glow. So to paint this in Imperium issue 2, you get a pot of Runelord brass. Whoa, okay, time out. Sorry to interrupt, but a couple of things here. First, whoever decided this should be named brass should probably have their eyes examined. It's more of a desaturated copper than anything. Also, while it's not the worst of Citadel's metallic range by far, looking at you, Gehenna's gold, when you compare it to the duraluminum, it looks like it ended up on the wrong end of a glitter bomb. The good news is, even if you're a die-hard Citadel paints user, there's something that can help us here: Guilliman Flesh. For each of these metallic variations, we're going to use a transparent, contrast-like paint to give us some easy, natural shading while letting that metallic shine come through. I, however, in my eternal quest to seemingly make things more difficult than they need to be, will not be using contrast paints. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is the finish. While contrast paints can be used to great effect for this sort of thing, they dry with a semi-matte sort of finish, so you lose a little bit of that luster, and I've gone on so much about how great duraluminum is, I really kind of want to preserve that. Also, the YouTube metrics tell me that apparently y'all tend to like my DIY type videos, so what I'm going to be doing instead is another batch of my homemade contrast, this time focusing exclusively on acrylic inks. That's because acrylic inks dry with a glossy surface, which will just help further maintain and even enhance the shine of that silver paint underneath. What I'm going to do instead of using Guilliman Flesh is make something that has a similar color but will dry more glossy. I start with a drop of burnt sienna with a little transparent raw umber mixed in. As I said in my homemade contrast paints video, which is linked in the description below, acrylic inks are dense with pigment. A few drops will easily fill one of these mixing palettes once properly diluted. A jar of ink typically costs less than a pot of contrast and could probably handily mix up enough paint to last you and your children their entire lives. To dilute it, I'm primarily adding two things: glaze medium and airbrush flow improver. I do also add a little water to some mixes if I need more transparency, and I go a little bit lighter on glaze medium than I did with the mix I used in my DIY contrast video, because glaze medium also has a somewhat matte finish to it. In retrospect, I think maybe something like gloss varnish would have given me the result I was really looking for, but live and learn. There's no exact ratio here, as always. I just keep diluting until the effect is close to what I want when I sweep it up onto the side of this mixing palette here. Handily, this steel dish is actually not far off the color we're going to be painting it over at the end of the day, so that's nice. Once I get the flow and transparency where I want it, I apply it a lot like I would any other contrast paint. If you were going to use contrast paint yourself, I highly recommend diluting many of them as well. The contrast medium thins it out just fine, and I do still use that on occasion, but I find a little flow improver and a tiny bit of medium does just fine for them too. So to take a minute here, there are a couple of advantages to thinning down even transparent paints like this. One of them is it's going to give you a lot more control. The whole idea that contrast paints were marketed under is that they do all the work for you, and they can to an okay degree, but you're going to get a lot more out of them in the long run if you're willing to thin them down a little bit and use that little bit of extra effort to push them into those recesses and sweep them away from those raised parts, and diluting them makes that easier to do. Plus, again, in a situation like this, the star of the show is that silver paint underneath, and the more layers of anything you put on there, the less that it's going to show through. Next, it's time to hit some of that gold from the official scheme. For this, I'm aiming for yellow, but one with some definite hints of brown in there too. The closest contrast analog I can think of would be Nazdreg yellow. So I took a warm yellow, in this case it was Dollar Rowney's Brilliant Yellow ink, and mixed in a little transparent raw umber. You know, one thing I've always found funny is that raw umber is darker than burnt umber. I don't know why that is. If you do, let me know down in the comments. After the gold's applied, I took a little bit of that bronzy mix from earlier and diluted it even further, then applied it to the shoulder carapace and head to give it just a little tint while still keeping it mostly looking silver. Now, at this point, I have a lot of the basic colors blocked in, but I'm still missing something if I want to get closer to the official paint scheme. I needed to add a little warmth in the rough neighborhood of red, so I grabbed my magenta ink and diluted it way down, then applied it in a very targeted way over a good chunk of what I had already done. This got me closer on the main body, but I was really happy with what it did in the gold areas. So the reason it gave such a striking effect, and I don't know how well the camera picked it up, but it really warmed that up, and that's because of the way the colors interact. And I'm afraid I have some bad news. We were lied to, almost all of us, at least in the States, as children, about many, many things. Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the viability of Beanie Babies as a long-term investment. But most of all, we were lied to about the color wheel. If you were anything like me, you grew up with red, yellow, and blue being the primary colors, and that's not far off the truth, but it's far enough for painting that it makes a difference. You see, for us, the primary colors are yellow, that got that one right, cyan, and magenta. Now the whole point of a primary color is that you cannot mix it by using other colors. And we can prove that red is thus not a primary color because when you take magenta, like I have here, and you put it over yellow, you get red. In varying saturations and degrees, but at any rate, putting that magenta ink directly over the yellow contrast underneath really warmed things up and gave us some nice gradients of oranges and even into browns in the recesses. Looks really good. Thanks, color theory. Now for the outer bits of the gun, I went pretty simple and repeated the same process as earlier, but with carbon black ink. Whether you're using black ink or Black Templar's contrast paint, you're going to want to dilute it a decent amount if you want it to look like anything other than just a blob of black. These pigments are really strong. I applied this to the silver joints and recesses between his little metal bones as well. Then it was onto some non-metallic paints. The inner rods of the gun got some Pro-Acryl Coal Black, and the central stripe on his head got Pro-Acryl Bright Neutral Gray, which I then worked up to white at some of the brighter spots. Then it was time for one of the Necron's most defining visual features, other than being made entirely of metal, the glow. I decided to try something a little bit different here and add some flow improver to white ink to see if I could get capillary action to pull the ink along various recesses where that Gauss energy is supposed to be flowing, and it worked decently. My intent was to go over that with Pro Acryl Transparent Green, but it leaned a little too cool for me, so I grabbed some of their regular green paint and did the same thing. After that, I hit the high points with some bright yellow green, and finally a little bit of AK Interactive Fluorescent Green to top it all off. Now, at this point, you could probably call this guy good enough and put him on the table and have him look just fine, and maybe that's the approach you want to take if you're in a real speed paint mode and trying to crank out a whole bunch of Necrons to get onto the tabletop quickly. But with just a couple extra steps and really not much extra time, we're going to take him a little further. My next step was to hit the edges of the metal surfaces with a quick dry brush. For this, I used a product I find myself reaching for more and more recently, Ammo by Mig's Dio airbrush paint. It has a really nice consistency for a dry brush paint, and its medium keeps it from getting too chalky when you wipe most of it off the brush. And finally, what would one of my painting videos be without an oil wash? This time I opted for Abteilung 502's Starship Filth. It's a nice green-gray that reminds me a little bit of old winter streaking grime formula, but with the properties of an oil. I was somewhat targeted in my application with this wash, especially trying to avoid the areas that I just made neon glowing green. While a lot of the techniques I used here are pretty familiar ground for me, I did try to push myself and apply them in slightly different ways than I have before, and I think it's a good practice to do something like that. Now, am I going to throw out all my other metallic paints and use duraluminum for everything? No. Fact is that a lot of the time it is just easier to be able to reach for something pre-mixed, and like I said earlier, these Vallejo metal color paints can be pretty runny. This was more as a proof of concept, and the thing is, you can apply the exact same principles to any other metallic. Need to warm up that gold? As we learned earlier, thanks to color theory, toss in a little bit of magenta. You need a bluish silver, but only for one or two models? Well, instead of shelling out for an entire pot of paint, you could add a drop or two of Talisar blue or whatever blue ink you might have into a little bit of silver. Also, I think I somehow quietly let these 1,000 subscriber mark slip by without really mentioning it much on the channel, so huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed. When I started this about 4 months ago-ish, I had no idea how quickly things would grow, and that's all thanks to people like you, and to great people like Ben over at Battle Brothers Tabletop, who let me do a collab with him a couple weeks ago. If you're working on some Necrons and want something to listen to while you paint, you can take a look at this playlist, which will have a bunch of lore videos I've done, including some looking at the Necrons. Or maybe you're interested in seeing the first model I painted from the Imperium Magazine, and why yellow isn't as scary as you might have been led to believe. Until next time, remember, it's just paint, and thanks for watching.